If NATO and the United States are real champions of democracy, they must let the Ukrainian people decide about their political future. Isn't the election the key element of democracy, and isn't the democracy what Westerners preach about all the time? The ramification is nothing but the start of World War III. Russia is disintegrating Ukraine. This is a move to Ukraine division. I think US must stop this process. Why are the US and NATO worried about the elections in East Ukraine? They should let the people decide their own future. Whether US, EU, UN and NATO accept the election or not, it won't change the legality of the decision of the Ukrainians.
Well, what about that, Mr. Badowski? What would be the problem with letting the people of these regions decide for themselves what they want to do?
Oh, no, they should be able to decide what they want to do for themselves. They should do it in December, not in November.
Why?
They should do it under the laws of Ukraine, because that's the way democratic elections are supposed to work. Vladimir Putin, who's no friend to democratic elections in Russia or anywhere else, really is in no moral position or legal position to be telling the people of Ukraine what to do.
And
separatists.
And on that note, sir, what about the West? I'm so sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Badowski, but is Washington in the moral position to tell them what to do, or the EU in the moral position? Who's in the moral position? Who determines who gets the right?
No, the moral position is held by the government of Ukraine. The moral position is held by the government of Ukraine, which the Europeans support, Eastern Europe supports it, the United States supports it. We're not telling anyone what to do. It's the government of Ukraine choosing its own destiny, not a group of separatists, criminals, bombers, killers, and not Putin, who, by the way, not long ago was having his weapons shoot down a Malaysian Airlines plane.
Well, sir, many would say these people that you're saying can determine, Mr. Badowski, many would say that those who you're saying can determine the right of Ukraine.
If there was an agreement,
those who can, you're saying that they have the right to determine the direction of Ukrainian government, as you're saying. Well, many would say that they have come into power illegally because they replaced the democratically elected government via a coup d'etat. But let's cross over to New York. Sir, back with you. Mr. Dreiser, tell me what, in your perspective, is going on here? Because we've seen this tug of war now between Moscow and Washington for a while. It appears on the surface that Russia has tried to continue to de-escalate the situation. We have seen now, we have a agreement, a gas agreement finally between Brussels and Kiev and Moscow. Couldn't Russia have basically not turned on the taps if they really wanted to play hardball?
Sure, let me get to that in a second. But I think that viewers should realize the Western arrogance that we're seeing here with my colleague there in Washington. Again, notice that NATO determines and the U.S. determines exactly what is and is not legitimate. It was certainly legitimate for the people of Kosovo to break away from Serbia under NATO bombardment. That was somehow legitimate. South Sudan to break away from Sudan under the pressure of the United States and the West. That was legitimate. The government in Syria, which was elected by more than 80% of the electorate, illegitimate. So what you see then is legitimacy is conferred upon elections based on the U.S. political agenda, not based on objective democratic principles. And this is precisely the point that has been made over and over and over again. If it was good enough for Kosovo, if it was good enough for South Sudan, why was it not good enough for Crimea? Why is it not good enough for Donetsk and Lugansk? The reality is that individuals such as the gentleman in Washington act as de facto guardians of the U.S. line, the U.S. foreign policy agenda. And you can sit there and you can legitimize that all you want, but the reality is the people of Donetsk and Lugansk have had their representation taken away from them. They do not have any representation now in the Rada, the Kiev parliament, and so now naturally they're going to look at themselves and say the only option that we have is true self-determination. And I think that that's reasonable and practical. Now, we also heard repetition of an outright lie that Putin is involved in shooting down MH17. Either the gentleman there apologizes or he admits his utter ignorance, because nobody in the world is saying that. Not even the United States government is saying that, because they don't have the evidence to back that up. Again, we should keep in mind that Donetsk and Lugansk took up arms after the coup. They took up arms after the Nazis and the oligarchs took control of a democratically elected government and tried to pass legislation basically as a form of oppression.
Okay.
The memory of 1941 to 1945 is very fresh in their minds, and don't you forget that.
Well, let me ask you the question that I asked my guests in New York. The other part of that question was, if Russia really wanted to play hardball, couldn't they have in dealing with the gas situation?
Well, number one, they could have, but Russia needs the cash. Russia is going broke. Russia has a big economic problem. Gas prices, oil prices are going down, and Russia's losing a lot of money. At the same time, sure, they could have stopped it, and they would have lost more money on it, and then Vladimir Putin could give more speeches to the Russian people about why they have to endure hardship so he can invade Ukraine. At the same time, what could well happen if this continues, I hope not, would not be war, but there'll be more sanctions. Now, let me ask anyone out there, let me ask my colleague here in New York. I have named a long list of governments around the world that will not recognize this election. I dare him to name one that will. Give me the list right now. Who has said that they're going to recognize the election that I have named a long list of countries that will not recognize?
Do you believe those governments act independently? Do those governments make their own decisions, or are those governments merely satellites and appendages of the United States and U.S. foreign policy? If you truly believe that the governments around the world that don't actually have a say in their own, I'm sorry?
You tell me every government in the world is under the domination of the U.S.?
I didn't hear what he said.
You can't name one government.
Well,
you can't name one government that will recognize the Eastern Europe election.
Mr. Badowski, I'm going to just jump in here, because the countries you named, you named Western and you named Eastern Europe and you named the United States. Do these countries represent the whole world?
But name one anywhere that will
I'm asking you a different question, sir. I'm asking you a different question, because you said the whole world.
I'm telling you, none of them will, and the entire world can't be wrong. That's my point.
Go ahead, New York.
Name a country that will recognize the election.
Go ahead, New York. You wanted to jump in?
Well, Number one, the election is the secondary issue, because you should recall that China and Iran and India and most of the countries that represent the non-Western world, that is the BRICS, they have refused to back any of the sanctions. They have refused to take a stand against Russia, because they understand quite clearly that this is a U.S. geopolitical gambit. Now, you think you're making some kind of a point by talking about the recognition of elections. Recognition of elections is a function of political ideology and of power in the world. It is not something that exists in a vacuum. This is a straw man argument designed by a weak-minded and, well, what can we call it? Hack journalist.
Okay, well, let's, Mr. Badowski.
You can't name one. That's it. I rest my case.
Mr. Badowski,
I rest my case. You can't name one.
Tell
There's
me.
not one country in the world that he can claim will recognize this election.
Mr. Badowski, now after the elections,
you couldn't name
sir,
one. I tried
after
three
the
times.
elections, and let's say that they vote and they are going to vote for their prime minister and parliamentarians, what happens, as you say, if you say the Europeans and the United States will not accept this election? How likely are we to see an exacerbation of the tension between these regions, and how dangerous is that?
Well, I hope we do not see an exacerbation. I fear that we may. What I suspect will happen is they will resume negotiations, reach agreements, and then hopefully honor those agreements. But again, we're here today to discuss the election, and my colleague here cannot name one country that will recognize it. What does that tell us? That he can't name one? Is the entire world wrong and he's right and Putin's right? Now, what they need to do, the Russians need to back off. the Americans, the Europeans, and the Ukrainians need to reach out and reach an agreement with the Eastern Ukrainian people for an election under the law, not in November, and they should try to work out a formula to respect each other, agree with each other, live with each other in peace, stop killing each other.
All right,
but I'll repeat it again. We're here today to discuss the elections.
Mr. Dreister, out of New York, sir, this is
the political representation.
Go ahead, sir.
The political representation of the people of Eastern Ukraine has been taken away from them. Whatever elections are carried out under the auspices of Kiev are a sham because they cannot possibly represent the people of the East, which is the reason for the elections that are taking place there. There is no Communist Party of Ukraine anymore, the most popular party in the East. There is no Party of Regions anymore, the other most popular party in the East. And so you're asking, well, why don't the people of East Ukraine choose between Nazi parties and oligarch parties? The reality is they don't have any representation. They have been utterly marginalized and disenfranchised, not to mention oppressed by force. And that is why you have the situation you have here today. And again, we return to the validity of elections. Elections are only valid from the perspective of the United States if they recognize them. Well, here's the reality. Russia, under an agreement that they reached, in more or less a handshake agreement, recognized the elections in Kiev, despite the fact that those elections were held under extreme circumstances and voter intimidation. They recognized it as a form of compromise. What you see is that the United States and its puppet government in Kiev refuses to do the same. And the reality is because they know that their policy and their strategy is morally, politically, ethically, and militarily bankrupt, just as the country of Ukraine is bankrupt.
All right,
and the only way it will come back from that is with help from Russia and from Europe and the United States.
And on that note, we are out of time. I appreciate both of you being with us. Founder of StopImperialism.com, Mr. Eric Dreister, out of New York, and columnist from The Hill, Mr. Brent Budowski, out of Washington. And thank you, viewers, for being with us on another debate. I'm Marzieh Hashemi, signing out for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Thanks so much and goodbye.